The cabin was too quiet for comfort. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the sort that comes when everyone senses trouble and no one dares to speak. A row of passengers sat stiff in their seats, eyes darting toward the aisle where one woman stood, her hands relaxed at her sides, refusing to move. Margaret Jones did not shout, did not wave her arms. She simply stared back at the flight attendant who had accused her, unflinching, the calm center of a storm that wasn't hers to begin with. The accusations came fast, each one sharper than the last. She refused to comply. She's disturbing the cabin. She might be a threat. None of it was true, but truth has little weight when it is buried beneath confidence spoken loudly. Margaret's seat number was valid, her boarding pass flawless, yet the uniformed attendant acted as though she had smuggled herself into a place where she did not belong. The whispers among the crew grew bolder. One leaned into another's ear, eyes fixed on her as though she were a problem to be removed. The passengers picked up on it quickly. Some looked away, unwilling to involve themselves, while others kept sneaking glances, silently questioning if they should believe what they were hearing. Margaret held her ground. Her voice, steady and measured, cut through the noise. "You know this isn't true." She didn't plead. She didn't beg. She made a statement, yet the attendant smirked as though already tasting victory. Authority shifted in that moment. The crew knew they had numbers, and numbers alone can drown out reason. With a few quiet exchanges, they began shaping a story that would justify what they wanted, her removal. A story the passengers would carry with them long after landing. Margaret remained still, her eyes steady, scanning the faces around her. She noticed the small details, the twitch of a hand, the stiffness of a posture, the rehearsed certainty in the crew's tone. Years of training kept her composed. Years of being underestimated gave her the patience to wait. The air inside the cabin seemed heavier as uniformed staff positioned themselves closer, ready to act. Passengers leaned away from the aisle as though distance could shield them from the rising tension. Margaret adjusted her jacket slightly, a subtle movement, but her focus never wavered. One attendant spoke louder, raising the accusation for all to hear. "She threatened me. She's not safe." Gasps followed. The lie had been planted, and now it grew rapidly, feeding on fear. Margaret tilted her head, not in disbelief, but with the controlled expression of someone who understood the rules of this game all too well. This wasn't the first time authority had been abused in front of her. It wouldn't be the last. But what the crew didn't know, what not a single passenger could guess, was that Margaret Jones was not who they assumed. She wasn't just another woman of color traveling alone. She wasn't defenseless. She wasn't powerless. She carried a truth that could shatter every false word being spoken. But timing mattered. One move too soon, and everything she had worked for could collapse. The crew leaned closer, signaling to ground authorities through the cockpit. Passengers looked on, caught between unease and silence. Margaret breathed once, steady and deliberate, as the wheels of accusation pressed harder. Because this was more than a simple flight, and she was more than just a passenger. Quick note before we continue. If stories like this grip you, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss the next one. And let me know in the comments, what country are you watching from? I'd love to see where our community is tuning in across the world. Back in the cabin, Margaret's eyes narrowed just slightly, not with fear, but with restraint. The lies were piling high enough to bury her. The crew, confident they had won, failed to notice the faint edge in her expression, the look of someone holding back a truth that could flip the balance in an instant. And when that truth came, it would not only stop the lies, it would expose the people spreading them. Margaret Jones was the kind of woman people often underestimated at first glance. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to announce herself, who knew her place in the world was earned, not handed down. In her everyday clothes, blending into the line of passengers moving through the terminal, she looked like anyone else. A black woman with a carry-on and a ticket. No one would guess the weight of the badge tucked away in her jacket, hidden from sight but never far from her mind. Her life had been shaped by discipline. Years in the field had stripped her of illusions, replacing them with instincts sharper than most people would ever understand. Margaret was an officer for the CIA, though only a handful of people in her orbit knew. For most who passed her by, she was simply that woman at the gate. Polite, reserved, unassuming. That was the point. Staying invisible was part of the job. And yet, on that day, Invisibility was denied to her. She had chosen that particular flight because it was supposed to be uneventful, a connection before her next assignment. No fanfare, no mission reports, just a few hours of silence above the clouds. She longed for it, just one quiet flight where she could rest, reset, and prepare herself for the tasks ahead. For someone in her line of work, peace wasn't a luxury, it was rare treasure. But peace often slips from the hands of those who crave it most. Margaret's upbringing had prepared her to expect the unexpected. Raised in a working-class neighborhood, she learned early how to stand tall when others tried to cut her down. Teachers who doubted her, neighbors who whispered, and strangers who assumed weakness at the sight of her skin. She remembered it all. Her path into intelligence wasn't paved with favors. It was built with determination and the refusal to let anyone else define her worth. Her colleagues described her as methodical, but what they admired most was her patience. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent. That patience had saved lives in undercover operations, where one wrong word could mean the difference between safety and disaster. And yet patience was not the same as submission. Margaret carried herself with dignity, even in spaces where others made it clear she was unwelcome. Airports had become one of those places. Too often, she had been asked, "Are you sure you're in the right line? Or is this your ticket?" The questions came coded with politeness, but the meaning cut deep. Each one reminded her of the quiet suspicion attached to her presence in spaces of comfort, wealth, or privilege. That day was no different. As she approached the gate, she noticed the attendant's eyes sweep over her, lingering just long enough to send a message. It wasn't about security, it was about assumption. A quick glance, a raised eyebrow, a pause that told her, "You don't belong here." Margaret had seen that look in boardrooms, in hotels, even in grocery stores. It was the universal language of doubt, spoken without words. Still, she kept her composure. She always did. Handing over her boarding pass, she waited for the scanner's green light. It flashed approval, undeniable proof that her seat was valid. But approval didn't erase bias. As she moved toward the jet bridge, she heard the attendant's quiet sigh, the one meant to convey irritation without a word spoken. She felt the weight of eyes following her down the narrow passageway. Inside the aircraft, Margaret placed her bag neatly overhead and lowered herself into the seat she had booked weeks earlier. She smoothed her jacket and exhaled slowly. Here, finally, was her chance to relax. To blend in, to become another face among strangers. But blending in was never easy when people saw what they wanted, not what was real. Margaret looked around and noticed how quickly perceptions shifted in confined spaces. Some passengers smiled at her politely, others looked away altogether. It wasn't hostility, but it was distance. And distance had a way of turning into something more. She brushed it aside, focusing on the steady hum of the engines outside the window. A flight was supposed to be a reset, a pause from the chaos of her duties. Yet the irony hung heavy. The one moment she longed to be invisible was the very moment she was about to be dragged into the spotlight. Margaret adjusted her seatbelt and closed her eyes for a moment, unaware that whispers among the crew had already begun. What she thought would be a quiet journey was quickly turning into the stage for a confrontation she neither invited nor deserved. And as the first subtle signs of doubt spread through the cabin, Margaret Jones knew the silence she had hoped for would not survive this flight. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and polished steel, the kind of atmosphere meant to whisper privilege. First class was arranged to soothe nerves before takeoff. Wide seats, blankets folded like hotel linens, attendants moving with rehearsed efficiency. Margaret Jones stepped in, her boarding pass still in hand, her stride even and quiet. She knew where she belonged. Row 3, Seat A. She had booked it weeks in advance, her confirmation printed, her ticket clear. Yet the moment she paused at her row, the eyes found her. A few passengers glanced up from their screens, their expressions shifting with an unspoken question. Is she supposed to be here? The first cut came quickly. A flight attendant, white, mid-30s, stopped in the aisle with a professional smile that strained at the edges. She tilted her head as she glanced at the ticket in Margaret's hand. "Are you sure this is your seat?" The tone was polite on the surface, but the undertones stung. Margaret held up her boarding pass, steady. "Yes, row 3, Seat A." The attendant didn't even glance at the seat number before leaning closer, voice dropping just enough for nearby passengers to hear. Sometimes these tickets get mixed up. First class is very specific. The word clung to the air like a warning. Margaret resisted the urge to sigh. She had heard variations of that same sentence more times than she cared to count. At restaurants, at hotel desks, even at corporate receptions. Each time a suggestion that she was in a place she didn't belong. She had learned to respond with calm, never heat, because heat was the very trap they set. Her answer was measured. It's the right ticket. The attendant's eyes lingered, traveling from Margaret's jacket to her shoes, pausing as though searching for a mistake. Nothing about Margaret's appearance was out of place. Neat, professional, understated. And still, suspicion tightened the attendant's jaw. Passengers nearby began to shift. A man in a navy suit adjusted his tie, pretending to scroll on his phone while stealing glances. A woman 2 rows back leaned forward, her brows raised. Some faces softened with sympathy, but none spoke. Others turned away altogether, eager to distance themselves from a moment they knew carried weight. Margaret lowered into her seat, placing her bag neatly beneath the chair in front of her. She could feel the eyes on her, the tension filling the space like static. The irony pressed against her chest. She had survived hostile interrogations abroad, read danger in foreign marketplaces, and passed through borders with forged names. Yet here, in her own country, a boarding pass in her hand, she was treated like a trespasser. The attendant lingered a moment longer before forcing a smile and moving on, but the damage had already been done. A seed of doubt had been planted in the minds of passengers who had witnessed the exchange. Some would carry it with them for the rest of the flight, quietly convinced she didn't deserve her seat. Margaret leaned back, her face unreadable. Years of training kept her movements deliberate, her breathing steady, but beneath the surface, unease pressed against her ribs. Not fear, never fear, but the familiar ache of recognition. She knew this wasn't about a mistake in seating or airline procedure. It was about perception. Her gaze wandered across the cabin. Rows of white faces, scattered with a handful of passengers of color, each carrying their own kind of silence. A young man 2 rows away caught her eye and gave the faintest nod, as if to say he saw what had just happened. But his glance broke quickly, swallowed by the weight of being outnumbered. The flight attendant reappeared moments later, her voice raised slightly this time. "Ma'am, could you show me your ID again? Just to confirm." The words sliced through Margaret's patience. She unclipped her wallet, slid out her identification, and placed it in the attendant's hand without a flicker of hesitation. The attendant glanced at it quickly, her cheeks flushing faintly before handing it back. "Thank you," she muttered, moving down the aisle. Margaret tucked the ID away and folded her hands in her lap. She did not need gratitude, nor did she expect fairness. What she wanted was the quiet journey she had paid for. But already, the flight had shifted. Already, the quiet had been stolen. The seatbelt sign chimed above, passengers settling in, but the tension did not lift. It clung to her like an unwanted shadow. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, her body still, her mind sharp. This was supposed to be a flight like any other, but the glances told her otherwise. Every whisper of fabric, every glance exchanged among crew members, told her she was not simply a passenger. She had become a subject of suspicion. And the story forming around her was only just beginning. The engines rumbled to life, and the plane edged toward the runway. Margaret adjusted her seatbelt, exhaling slowly, determined to salvage some peace from the unease. But peace, once fractured, rarely returns whole. The flight attendant from earlier drifted past her row, a thin smile masking the edge in her eyes. She bent toward a colleague, her voice pitched low but not low enough. Margaret caught fragments. "She's already making it difficult. Better keep an eye." The colleague nodded, casting a glance back toward Margaret, as though confirmation alone was evidence. It started small. A beverage cart stopped at her row, and the attendant accidentally tipped a cup of water. It splashed across Margaret's tray, soaking the edge of a folder she had pulled from her bag. The apologies came quickly, layered with false sweetness. "So sorry, ma'am, these things happen." But the smirk told a different story. Margaret dabbed the spill with a napkin, silent. She had been in interrogation rooms overseas where silence was her shield. She would not let this woman's performance drag her into a scene. Still, she could feel the eyes. Passengers glanced up from their headphones, from books and phones, watching her reaction as if measuring whether she fit the story being built around her. Soon after, another attendant leaned over the aisle. "Ma'am, please keep your voice down." The rebuke came out of nowhere. Margaret had not spoken a word since takeoff. She opened her eyes, steady, I haven't said anything. The attendant shrugged, turning to the passengers around them. Several people have mentioned complaints. Lies travel faster than truth. A whisper spoken with confidence can reshape the room, and here at 30,000 feet, the room was theirs to control. Margaret felt the shift, the way passengers now glanced at her differently. Not all with hostility, some with quiet doubt, others with the discomfort of people who recognized an injustice but feared the weight of challenging it. One man across the aisle cleared his throat as if to speak up, but his wife pressed her hand against his arm, pulling him back into silence. Margaret noticed. She noticed everything, the way silence often did more damage than lies themselves. Her training urged restraint. She could speak, raise her voice, demand fairness. But doing so would confirm the caricature they were crafting, the loud, difficult black woman, disrupting order in a space that never wanted her there to begin with. Her power lay not in reacting, but in recording, remembering, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. The attendants weren't finished. They passed by her row again, this time whispering louder than before. She's not following instructions, she's ignoring protocol. Margaret lifted her head slowly, locking eyes with the nearest attendant. I've done nothing wrong. The attendant blinked, lips curling in a faint smile. We'll let security decide that when we land. The words landed like a stone. Around her, passengers stiffened. Security. That word was heavy in an airport, heavier still mid-air. It was the perfect tool. Invoke safety, and everything else, the truth, fairness, dignity, could be dismissed. Margaret straightened in her seat, her voice still calm. You're lying? And you know it. The attendant leaned down, speaking softly enough that only she could hear. People will believe me, not you. For a fraction of a second, Margaret felt the sting, not of fear, but of familiarity. That sentence had followed her for much of her life, spoken in different ways, by different people, all meaning the same thing. Power decides who is believed. And here, trapped in this cabin, the power tilted against her. She glanced around. The man in the navy suit shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight. The young woman, 2 rows back, looked away when their eyes met. Margaret recognized the patterns of complicity, sympathy without courage. The attendants walked away, whispering to the cockpit. Margaret unclasped her hands and rested them on her knees. She breathed evenly, the way she had been trained, reminding herself that panic never wins. She was no stranger to being outnumbered. But this time was different. This wasn't an operation in a foreign city or a staged debriefing. This was supposed to be a simple flight. And still, here she was, being painted as a threat in front of dozens of witnesses who would carry someone else's version of events into the world. Margaret tilted her head back, eyes fixed on the cabin ceiling. She had survived far worse than whispers. But the game unfolding now wasn't random. It was deliberate. And the story being woven about her had only just begun to take shape. The cabin had settled into the steady rhythm of flight. Trays clinked, screens glowed, and the quiet hum of engines filled the air. Yet around Margaret, that rhythm broke. The attendants had already whispered enough seeds of suspicion. Now they were watering them in full view. The lead attendant stopped at her row again, this time with a stern expression. Ma'am, I need you to step into the galley with me. We've had multiple reports of disruptive behavior. Margaret lifted her gaze slowly. I've been sitting here the entire time. Her words were even, but the attendant raised her voice just enough for surrounding passengers to hear. You threatened crew safety. We can't ignore that. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Margaret felt the heat of dozens of eyes on her, their stares heavy with judgment, curiosity, or quiet disbelief. A murmur traveled down the aisle, passengers whispering half-truths already reshaped by the authority of a uniform. She stayed seated, her tone measured. That's a lie. The attendant folded her arms. Then why are people uncomfortable? Why do we keep getting complaints? Passengers fidgeted. A man in business class shook his head faintly, as if he knew the accusation was false but lacked the courage to speak. A woman leaned toward her child, whispering something while gesturing toward Margaret's row. Margaret caught fragments. Dangerous. Causing trouble. Margaret's jaw tightened. She had been in interrogation chambers where silence was weaponized, but here the silence of others was worse than any question. People saw what was happening. They knew the story didn't add up. Yet silence kept them safe, and silence condemned her. The attendant leaned closer, her voice a sharp whisper. You're making this harder on yourself. Margaret didn't flinch. No, you are. It was then that another attendant appeared, holding a clipboard. We'll need her name and ID again for the incident report." Passengers craned their necks to see. Some faces showed doubt, others curiosity, and a few carried the smug certainty of people who believe rules are always enforced fairly. Margaret handed over nothing, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She had already shown her identification once. That was enough. The attendant's voice rose. "Non-compliance. Add that to the report." Margaret's stomach nodded, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of it. Her silence, her refusal to bow to lies, was being twisted into guilt. The spectacle grew. Attendants huddled in the aisle, speaking loudly enough to spread their version of events. She raised her voice. She's been aggressive. She refused service. Each lie rolled into the next until Margaret could feel the weight of narrative shifting entirely against her. Then came the final blow. The lead attendant stepped forward, pointing toward her seat. "For the safety of this flight, we may need to restrain her until landing." A collective gasp swept through the cabin. Passengers stared, some horrified, others quietly relieved it wasn't them. The young man who had earlier given her a sympathetic glance leaned forward now, his voice cracking. "She hasn't done anything. I've been watching." The attendant shot him a sharp look. "Sir, please remain in your seat. This doesn't concern you." The man sank back, his courage extinguished in a single command. Margaret studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before returning her gaze to the attendants. Her voice was steady, each word deliberate. "You are framing me, and you know it." The lead attendant smirked. "Passengers trust us. Who do you think they'll believe?" Margaret felt the sting of the words, not because they frightened her, but because they rang with the ugly truth she had lived with all her life. Authority so often meant credibility, and for a black woman, especially one traveling alone, doubt was a shadow that clung no matter how spotless her record or how calm her demeanor. A ripple of tension spread across the row as passengers shifted away from her seat. A woman pulled her bag closer. Another man whispered under his breath, "This is getting out of hand." But no one rose to stop it. Margaret pressed her palms against her knees, her breath slow and measured. She could not reveal who she truly was, not yet, but her patience was thinning. Every word spoken against her was a rope tightening, and she knew if she let it go unchecked, she would land in handcuffs. The attendants conferred again, one of them nodding toward the cockpit. The message was clear: ground security would be waiting. Margaret sat in silence, her posture straight, her eyes unwavering. Around her, the lies grew louder, spreading like wildfire, reshaping the truth into something unrecognizable. And all she could think as the plane cut through the sky was how a simple flight had become a stage for her humiliation, and how soon, very soon, the balance of power would shift. Margaret sat motionless, but her mind was anything but still. Years of training had sharpened her senses into tools, listening for tone, watching for hesitation, measuring the weight of silence as much as the sound of words. To anyone else, she was just a woman pinned by accusation, but inside, her thoughts were moving like pieces on a chessboard. She studied the lead attendant. Shoulders squared too tightly, lips pursed just enough to reveal she wasn't entirely sure of her own lies. Confidence on the surface, but nerves at the edges. Margaret had learned long ago that people who fabricate stories rarely hold their bodies steady. The shift in weight, the dart of the eyes, truth reveals itself in the body when the mouth refuses it. The other attendants moved differently. One avoided her gaze altogether, choosing instead to fuss over empty trays. Another whispered with the clipboard, clutching it like a shield. They weren't just acting out of policy, they were acting out of something personal. Margaret recognized it, the subtle arrogance of people who had decided someone like her didn't belong, and the comfort of knowing their uniforms made them believable. She inhaled slowly, reminding herself that reaction was the trap. If she raised her voice, it would become the proof they were searching for. If she argued, they would point to her tone as evidence of aggression. But if she said nothing, silence would still be twisted into guilt. It was a no-win game, at least for someone without tools. But Margaret had tools. Her thoughts flickered back to cases where silence had cost lives. In another assignment, a young man overseas had been accused of theft by a local officer. He insisted he was innocent, but language barriers and prejudice erased his voice. Margaret had stood by, gathering the threads of truth, and uncovered evidence that cleared him. But not before he spent weeks imprisoned, punished for nothing but assumption. Bias didn't always shout, sometimes it whispered, sometimes it hid behind the cloak of authority. And too often, Those whispers were taken as fact. Now, thousands of feet in the air, Margaret recognized the same pattern. She was being recast, line by line, into someone dangerous. She couldn't reveal who she truly was, not without compromising her assignment. The badge in her jacket wasn't a weapon she could flash at will. It came with rules, with timing, and exposing herself too soon could jeopardize the mission waiting for her on the other side of this flight. But being silent didn't mean being powerless. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, sliding her phone into her palm beneath the fold of her jacket. To anyone watching, she looked like a tired passenger scrolling. In reality, the recorder was already running. Each accusation, each whisper loud enough for her to catch, would be captured. She angled the phone just enough to catch faces when attendants leaned into her row. Evidence, piece by piece. Her eyes traveled the cabin, noting details like markers on a map. Row 2, the man in the navy suit, visibly uncomfortable but unwilling to act. Row 4, the young woman who looked away every time Margaret's eyes met hers. Row 5, the couple whispering, words she couldn't hear, but expressions that revealed they had chosen to believe the attendant's story. She memorized them all. Names, faces, behaviors. It was the same way she had once cataloged an underground network abroad, quietly, steadily, until every thread formed a pattern. Only this time, the battlefield wasn't a foreign city. It was an airplane cabin. The attendant's voices carried again, this time louder. She refused to cooperate. She raised her voice at me. Margaret clicked her phone screen dark, ensuring the recording continued unnoticed. Lies are fragile when documented. Truth, once captured, cannot be erased. She folded her arms, outwardly calm, inwardly rehearsing the steps she would take when the plane landed. A report filed here, a call made there. The chain of accountability would begin, not with anger, but with evidence. Her training reminded her of another lesson. Patience is power. Those who rush reveal their weakness. Those who wait expose it. Margaret had no intention of giving these attendants the spectacle they craved. Instead, she would give them something far worse: consequences. Still, unease pressed at her chest. Not for herself, but for the passengers watching in silence. How many of them had seen moments like this before? How many had looked away in grocery stores, in offices, in airports, choosing safety over courage? She wondered if any of them would remember her calm long after this flight ended, if they would ever connect the lie they had witnessed to the broader pattern of lives stained by bias. Margaret pressed her phone tighter in her hand, steady. Every second that passed, the record grew longer, stronger. Each smirk, each accusation, each whisper would find its place. For now, she remained still, eyes forward, her silence misread as surrender. But Margaret Jones was not surrendering. She was documenting, she was preparing, and when the wheels touched the ground, her silence would end. The announcement came overhead, the captain's calm voice instructing passengers to fasten seatbelts as the plane began its descent. For most on board, it was routine, a signal that the journey was nearly over. For Margaret, it was a countdown. Every second brought her closer to the ground, where the crew's lies would find new ears in uniforms and badges. She remained still, her phone resting in her palm, its screen dark, but its recorder capturing everything. The attendants moved briskly through the cabin, their voices pitched high enough for passengers to catch snippets. She's been uncooperative, hostile, refusing instructions. Each phrase was deliberately crafted to paint her as a risk. Margaret heard the words, felt the eyes that followed, and kept her posture unbroken. The wheels struck the runway with a jolt, the cabin shaking as brakes roared. Passengers clutched armrests, then relaxed as the plane slowed. Relief rippled through the rows, but Margaret's body remained taut, her mind calculating. She had expected this ending long before the descent began. When the plane rolled to a stop at the gate, the first movement came not from passengers reaching for overhead bins, but from the window, shadows of uniformed officers waiting outside. Margaret caught the glance of the man in the navy suit. His jaw tightened, guilt flickering across his face. He knew what was happening. He also knew he wouldn't intervene. The lead attendant raised her voice, tone sharp enough to slice through the cabin. Authorities will need to escort one passenger before deboarding begins. Please remain seated. Heads swiveled in unison, all eyes landing on Margaret. The words hung heavy in the stale cabin air. One passenger. No explanation needed. Everyone already knew who they meant. Margaret unfastened her belt with deliberate calm. She rose slowly, smoothing her jacket, her movements controlled. Every gesture carried dignity, even as the lie pressed against her shoulders like a weight. She stepped into the aisle, her chin level, her gaze forward. The authorities boarded quickly, 2 officers in dark uniforms scanning the rows before stopping at the sight of her. The attendant's voice rang again, rehearsed and sharp. "This is the passenger. She's been disruptive, threatened crew safety, and refused to comply." The passenger's reactions fractured instantly. A woman in row 4 muttered, "I knew it." Another leaned into her partner's shoulder, whispering about safety. Yet a voice from the back broke through the murmurs. The young man who had spoken earlier called out, "That's not true. She didn't do anything." The officers froze briefly, startled by the contradiction, but the attendant's certainty drowned him out. "Sir, please remain seated. You didn't see everything." Margaret met the young man's eyes for a moment, offering no smile, no nod, only the quiet strength of someone who knew his attempt had mattered, even if it hadn't changed the outcome. Then she turned back to the officers, her tone steady. "I'll come with you." They flanked her, one on each side, guiding her down the aisle. She walked without resistance, though every step burned with the humiliation of being paraded through rows of staring eyes. Some passengers lowered their gaze, unwilling to confront the injustice. Others watched intently, as though witnessing confirmation of a story they had already chosen to believe. At the gate, the lead attendant handed over her version of events like evidence. She refused orders, raised her voice, created a hostile environment. Each word delivered with the smug assurance of someone convinced of impunity. Margaret stood quietly, listening, her hands folded in front of her. The officers looked at her, waiting for a rebuttal, but she offered none. Timing mattered. Words spoken now, without the full weight of evidence, could be twisted as easily as the lies already circling her. She allowed the silence to stretch, allowed the attendants to believe they had won. Passengers filed off slowly behind her, the cabin buzzing with whispers. A woman brushed past, muttering, "Disgraceful." Another paused at the door, eyes wide with sympathy but lips sealed shut. Silence once again became the safer choice for most. Margaret stepped into the bright gate area, her posture still composed. Around her, travelers hurried to connections, oblivious to the quiet storm unfolding at one corner of the terminal. The officers guided her aside, the attendants lingering close enough to smirk, confident the matter was settled. But Margaret's expression never faltered. Inside, her thoughts were sharp, focused. She had the recordings, she had the names, the details, the evidence of each lie. And she had the patience to wait until the stage was larger, until the truth would cut louder than their whispers. For now, she let them believe she was subdued. For now, she let the humiliation play out. Because Margaret Jones knew the power of restraint. And when the moment came, restraint would transform into something they could not ignore. The fluorescent lights of the jet bridge washed over Margaret as the officers led her forward. The murmur of passengers spilled into the terminal, voices mixing with the beeps of scanners and the shuffle of hurried footsteps. To outsiders passing by, it might have looked like routine procedure, just another disruptive passenger being handled. But for Margaret, every second was layered with calculation. The attendants followed close behind, their posture tall with self-satisfaction. They had crafted their narrative carefully, each lie stitched to the next until it formed a fabric they thought would cover the truth. One of them stepped forward, speaking louder than necessary. "She refused safety instructions, threatened us in flight, and disrupted other passengers. She's a risk." The officer's eyes flicked between the attendant and Margaret. The balance of power still leaned toward the uniformed crew. Margaret's silence was heavy, deliberate. She let their story hang in the air a moment longer, giving them space to believe in their victory. Then, with a steady hand, she reached into her jacket. The attendant stiffened, expecting resistance, maybe even a struggle. What emerged instead was a leather wallet, plain and compact. Margaret flipped it open, holding it just high enough for the officers to see. The seal gleamed under the harsh light, letters embossed in gold, CIA. The air shifted instantly. The officers froze, their posture snapping into rigid attention. One cleared his throat, the authority in his tone suddenly gone. "Ma'am," his voice trailed off as he read the credentials, eyes widening. The attendants leaned in, confusion breaking across their faces. The smug certainty drained as quickly as it had appeared. "What is that?" one asked, her voice quivering despite the attempt to sound firm. Margaret's gaze cut to her, steady and unflinching. "It's what you should have thought about before framing me." The terminal seemed to still around them. Even nearby passengers paused in their stride, sensing the shift in energy. The authority that had shielded the attendants now slipped through their fingers, replaced with the quiet dread of accountability. The officer nearest to Margaret straightened, his tone measured but nervous. "Do you want to file an immediate statement, Agent Jones?" The name landed like a blow. Margaret's identity, hidden for hours, was now spoken aloud in front of the very people who had tried to erase her dignity. She didn't flinch. "Not here. Not now. But believe me, this won't disappear." The attendants scrambled to recover. We didn't know. She looked." Their words faltered. The excuses caught in their throats, half-finished sentences that only deepened the humiliation. Margaret snapped her wallet shut and tucked it away. "You didn't need to know who I was. All you needed to do was treat me with the same respect you give anyone else. And you failed." Passengers emerging from the jet bridge stopped to watch. Some whispered in astonishment, others in shame. The young man who had defended her earlier locked eyes with her briefly. This time, there was no silence. His nod carried relief, almost vindication. The officers turned to the attendants, their tone sharp now. "You'll remain here. There will be a full report." Panic flickered across their faces. The power they had wielded so freely on the plane had evaporated in an instant. Margaret didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply stood, unshaken, her posture radiating the authority they had tried to strip from her. She knew the fallout had only begun. Airline management would scramble to contain the story. Investigations would follow, statements would be taken, and apologies would arrive far too late. But none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was the undeniable truth now laid bare. Their lies had collapsed under the weight of her badge. Margaret's voice carried low but firm, cutting through the silence. "This isn't just about me. Think about what would have happened if I didn't have this badge. How many people have you treated this way, certain no one would believe them?" The attendants said nothing. Their silence, once a weapon, now revealed guilt. Margaret adjusted her jacket, her movements precise. She wasn't finished. This wasn't closure. This was only the beginning of accountability. And as she stepped away from the officers, her mind was already turning toward the next move. One that would ensure this flight would not fade quietly into memory. The moment Margaret's badge snapped shut, silence blanketed the gate area. The officers who had been ready to escort her away now stood at rigid attention, their expressions taut with unease. One of them adjusted his cap, his tone almost apologetic. "Agent Jones, do you wish to press charges immediately?" Margaret shook her head once, calm but resolute. "Not here. I'll file a formal report. This isn't over." The attendants stiffened, their confidence shattered. The lead attendant, who had delivered the loudest accusations midair, tried to find her voice. "We were just following procedure." Her words trembled, no longer anchored by authority. Margaret's eyes narrowed, her response cutting. "Procedure doesn't include fabricating threats. You didn't just question me, you tried to destroy my credibility in front of everyone here." The officers turned toward the attendants, jotting notes as they ordered them to stay behind for questioning. The passengers who had trickled into the terminal now gathered at a distance, some whispering in disbelief, others openly watching the spectacle. One woman murmured to her companion, "They really tried to frame her." Another man muttered, "If she hadn't shown that badge." His voice trailed off, but the implication hung heavy. Everyone knew what would have happened. Margaret would have been hauled away in handcuffs, her reputation dragged through the mud, her dignity stripped without recourse. Airline supervisors soon rushed to the scene, faces pale, voices strained with forced politeness. "Agent Jones, please accept our apologies. This is a misunderstanding." Margaret didn't move, didn't soften. A misunderstanding is forgetting someone's drink order. What happened on that flight was intentional. Your staff lied, and you believed them without question. That's not misunderstanding. That's systemic. The supervisors faltered, exchanging nervous glances. They weren't used to passengers speaking with such authority, and they certainly weren't prepared for one carrying federal credentials. Within the hour, the situation escalated beyond their control. Calls were made, higher-ups were notified. By the time Margaret was seated in a private office away from the gate, airline executives were already scrambling to contain the damage. Their tone shifted from defense to desperation, pleading for her discretion. But Margaret was not interested in their pleas. She was interested in accountability. She pulled out her phone, opening the recordings she had captured midair. The room went still as the audio played. Attendants whispering lies, accusing her of raising her voice when she hadn't spoken, threatening to restrain her without cause. Each clip dismantled their defense piece by piece. "This is your evidence," she said flatly, sliding the phone across the table. "I don't need to exaggerate or embellish. Your staff did the work themselves." The executives' faces drained of color. One tried to interject, mumbling about internal review, but Margaret cut him off. "Internal review won't fix this. You endangered me, embarrassed me, and exposed the passengers on that flight to a dangerous abuse of authority. This requires more than apologies." Outside that office, the story was already spreading. Several passengers had posted on social media, describing how a calm black woman had been accused of being a threat, only to reveal herself as CIA. Photos of officers escorting her off the plane had gone viral, paired with captions that told only part of the story. The truth was louder than any press release the airline could draft. By evening, federal investigators had stepped in. Margaret's report wasn't just about her treatment. It was about the broader implications. If trained officers could be subjected to racial profiling in plain sight, what about ordinary passengers with no badge to shield them? The case quickly moved from an airline embarrassment to a national conversation about race, authority, and credibility in air travel. The attendants involved were suspended pending investigation, their careers hanging in the balance. The airline issued a statement filled with vague promises of commitment to diversity and inclusion, but it rang hollow against the weight of what passengers had witnessed. Margaret, however, wasn't chasing headlines. Her work was not about spectacle, but about justice. In her formal debrief with federal officials, she spoke clearly. "This isn't about my position. It's about the reality that my seat, my ticket, my silence, none of it was enough to protect me from their bias. The next person may not have a badge. What happens to them?" Her words cut through the bureaucracy, forcing those in power to confront the deeper truth. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a system where perception too often outweighed fact, and where black travelers were forced to navigate layers of suspicion even at 30,000 feet. Margaret left the office that night, not with relief, but with resolve. The attendants had been exposed, the airline shaken, and the government alerted. But for her, the true consequence was only beginning. She knew the battle ahead wasn't about one flight. It was about ensuring no one else would sit in a seat they had paid for, only to be told they didn't belong. The hours after the incident blurred together in movement, briefings, written statements, and a barrage of apologies that all sounded the same. Margaret moved through them with the same composure she had shown on the plane. Her silence unnerved executives who expected outrage, but Margaret had learned long ago that silence, when paired with truth, could be sharper than any outburst. By the time she stepped into her hotel room later that evening, the weight of the day finally settled. She sat by the window, watching planes cut across the night sky, each one carrying passengers who believed they were safe in their seats. She thought of how quickly that illusion had shattered for her, how fragile dignity felt when others were determined to erase it. She replayed the scene in her mind. The smirk of the lead attendant, the whispers, the lies spoken as if fact. None of it surprised her. What gnawed at her was the passenger's silence. Dozens of witnesses had seen the truth. Only one had spoken, and even then, he had been silenced almost instantly. That silence, more than the attendant's words, reminded her of the uphill battle black travelers faced every day. Margaret had spent her career serving her country in places where her presence was hidden. She had operated under false names, worn disguises, and built stories that concealed her identity. Yet on that flight, in her own country, her true self was erased not by disguise, but by prejudice. It was a different kind of cover, one forced upon her by people who assumed authority was theirs to weaponize. But Margaret was not powerless. The recordings she had gathered were already secured in official hands. Investigations would run their course, consequences would follow. Yet she knew accountability wasn't enough. Accountability punished individuals. What she wanted was change that would outlive one case, one crew, one airline. Her reflection shifted something her grandmother used to say: strength isn't in how loud you fight, it's in how long you stand when the fight feels endless. Margaret understood that more now than ever. She had stood tall, not because she was CIA, but because she was tired of watching silence bury the truth. The next morning, she sat in front of a camera for a closed-door session with federal officials. They asked her to recount everything again. times, words, behaviors. She did so with the same steady clarity. But when they asked if she wanted to remain anonymous in public reports, she paused. Her instinct, sharpened by years of undercover work, told her to stay hidden. But her conscience pressed differently. If she stayed silent, the story would fade into the pile of incidents dismissed as misunderstandings. If she stepped forward, she could put a face to the truth. Margaret lifted her chin. "Leave my name on it." The room went quiet. The officials exchanged glances, one of them cautioning, "That may draw attention you don't want." Her reply was firm. "I didn't want attention on that plane either, but it found me anyway. I'd rather use it than run from it." Within days, the story spread beyond airline gossip. News outlets reported not only on the humiliation she faced, but also on the fact that she was an officer whose duty was compromised by bias. Civil rights groups picked it up, pointing to the incident as evidence of a larger pattern. The airline's statement of apology was drowned out by testimonies from passengers who admitted they had watched injustice unfold and said nothing. Margaret's reflection wasn't about revenge. It was about perspective. She knew the badge had shielded her in ways others could never count on. What haunted her most was imagining what might have happened if she hadn't revealed it. If she had been just another black woman, traveling home after work, framed and powerless in the face of lies. That thought became her fire. She began drafting a private memo to her superiors, urging policy reviews not just within the CIA, but across federal partnerships with airlines. She suggested mandatory training, stronger oversight, and clear accountability measures for discriminatory practices. Her words were sharp, not because she wanted recognition, but because she knew silence had already cost too much. Margaret's power wasn't in the badge she carried. It was in her decision to speak when silence would have been easier. And as she closed her laptop, she knew the fight ahead would be long. But she also knew she was ready. The story spread faster than the airline could contain it. Within hours, hashtags trended, timelines flooded with passenger testimonies, and video clips from the gate began circulating. A short, grainy recording captured the attendants pointing at Margaret, followed by the moment she revealed her badge. That clip, barely 20 seconds long, gathered millions of views. But what resonated wasn't just the badge, it was the commentary that came with it. Viewers across the country latched onto one haunting question. What if she hadn't been CIA? Social media was filled with voices echoing the same fear. That could have been my mother. I've been asked the same question about my seat before. I was humiliated on a flight just last year. Stories poured out, each one a reminder that Margaret's experience wasn't an anomaly, it was part of a pattern. News anchors debated it in prime time. Some emphasized the danger of racial profiling in air travel, while others focused on the airline's fumbling response. Civil rights advocates pointed out that Margaret's case was unique only because she had proof of authority strong enough to counter the lies. Most black travelers don't carry a federal badge, one activist said on air. And when they speak, they're ignored, or worse, punished. Margaret watched the coverage quietly, never once smiling at the vindication. For her, this wasn't about headlines or praise. It was about the passengers who had sat silently as lies piled against her, and the countless others who had endured the same silence in other cabins, other gates, other terminals. Letters began arriving, forwarded through her agency. Some handwritten, others typed, but each carrying the weight of lived experience. One came from a teacher in Atlanta who wrote, "Your story gave me courage. I stood up for a student today when I saw him being treated unfairly." Another came from a nurse in Chicago. "This happened to me in the airport with my children. I thought I was alone. I know now I'm not." Not all messages were kind. Some accused her of exploiting her position, insisting the attendants had only been doing their job. Margaret didn't flinch at those words. She had heard them all her life, phrases meant to excuse bias, to cover prejudice with professionalism. She filed them away as more proof of the work left to be done. What mattered most were the voices of those who felt seen for the first time. In community centers, churches, and online forums, her name was spoken as a reminder that injustice could be challenged. Some even began calling her the passenger who turned silence into evidence. The airline tried to recover. Free vouchers were offered, executives appeared on camera with carefully rehearsed apologies, and promises of training were announced. But their words fell flat against the recordings Margaret had already handed over. Passengers had heard the lies with their own ears. No press release could erase that. Margaret's reflection deepened as she read more testimonies. She realized her ordeal had cracked open something larger than one incident. It had forced people to look at the quiet ways racism operated, not just in violent outbursts, but in everyday assumptions that placed suspicion on her body before she spoke a word. She remembered the young man on the plane who had tried to defend her, only to be silenced. His hesitation stayed with her. It reminded her that complicity often wasn't born of agreement, but of fear. Fear of standing alone, fear of punishment, fear of being the next target. That was why her story mattered, not because she was CIA, but because it exposed what so many already knew. Bias didn't need proof to spread, it only needed authority to back it. And silence gave it room to grow. As the days passed, public forums asked new questions. How should airlines handle complaints rooted in prejudice? Should passengers be held accountable for staying silent? How can systems be changed so truth isn't crushed under the weight of assumption? Margaret didn't pretend to have every answer, but she knew this. Her voice had sparked conversations that could not easily be silenced again. And for every person who reached out to her, she understood the responsibility that came with being heard. Margaret Jones never asked for recognition. She didn't want her story on news feeds, nor her name stamped across headlines. What she wanted was simple: to sit in the seat she had paid for, to travel in peace, and to be treated with the dignity every human being deserves. But on that flight, her dignity was challenged, and her silence was mistaken for weakness. Yet silence was never her weakness. It was her strategy. When she finally revealed the badge hidden in her jacket, the lie collapsed under its own weight. The attendants who had built their story on prejudice suddenly found themselves staring at the truth they had never considered: that the woman they targeted was not powerless, not invisible, not disposable. She was a federal officer, and even then, she shouldn't have needed a badge to prove her worth. Margaret didn't raise her voice or demand glory. She allowed the evidence to speak, her recordings dismantling every false claim. What she proved in that moment was larger than her own case. She showed how racism thrives on assumption and how easily authority can be weaponized against the very people it is meant to serve. Her story forces a question that lingers long after the plane has landed. What would have happened if she wasn't CIA? Would the young man's defense have been enough? Would her calm have saved her, or would silence have condemned her completely? How many other travelers have been forced into humiliation without the shield of credentials, their voices drowned by the authority of a uniform? Margaret's ordeal is not just a single incident, it is a mirror reflecting the struggles of countless others who go unheard. For every video that goes viral, how many moments vanish unrecorded, dismissed as misunderstandings or written off as exaggerations? How many voices are silenced before they are heard? These are the questions her story leaves us with. And yet, even in the weight of it, Margaret's strength shines. She refused to break. She refused to meet lies with the anger they expected. Instead, she met them with evidence, with composure, and with truth. In doing so, she reminded everyone watching, on that flight, in that terminal, and now through this story, that justice does not always shout. Sometimes justice waits. Sometimes justice listens. And when the moment comes, justice speaks with a force that cannot be denied. Margaret didn't want glory. She wanted fairness. Her silence was power, but her truth was justice. Before we end, I want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed injustice in the air or anywhere? Did you speak up, or were you silenced by the weight of authority? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear from you. And if Margaret's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Here, we tell true human stories that matter. Stories that reveal injustice, highlight resilience, and remind us that silence only wins when we allow it to. Because every story, like Margaret's, carries a lesson. And the lesson is clear. Silence may protect lies, but truth, once spoken, changes everything.